pejoratively. He used the word capitalist pejoratively. By capitalist, he meant one who controlled capital and exploited labor as a result of state privilege in violation of free market principles. And he would point to specific ways that capitalists, as he's using it, had political power over the working class. And he saw this as exploitation. If you read him and don't know anything about him, you think, no, he's a Marxist or he's a communist of some kind. No, but he wasn't. He's sometimes called a Ricardian socialist. But socialism was used in different ways back then too. In fact, I can name you a couple of people who considered themselves free market socialists to make this really confusing. Franz Oppenheimer, for example, wrote a very good book called The State, about the origins of the state, which have been a book recommended to libertarians for years. And Benjamin Tucker, the individualist anarchist of the late 19th century, early 20th century, who had a very hot magazine in libertarian circles called Liberty back then. And again, they used socialist to mean not state ownership of the means of production, but an alternative to the situation in which you had a minority that owned basically the means of production, privately owned the means of production, although they might be getting state favors, and this is a story I'm going to get into ahead, so I don't want to jump ahead, and who then employ the large, basically property-less working class. And so some people who called them socialists in Tucker's day were simply people who wanted an alternative to that system. And some of them were statists who wanted the state to be the alternative. But Tucker and the people around him did not want the state to be an alternative. They thought it had come about through privilege, so they wanted to remove the privileges, and then they thought that workers would own the means of production through co-ops or single proprietorships or some other arrangement that didn't involve the state. And he was a total voluntarist, so he wasn't calling for state action. So socialism, at least in some circles, had that sort of meaning. It's lost that basically today. There are a few people around who use that term that way. Kevin Carson, who I'll quote, is one person who uses it that way. But I just want to bring that distinction up. In fact, and I was reminded out there by a friend of mine who mentioned that I've said, as I've put it, I think on some blog posts, in a linguistically ideal world, there would be two broad political philosophies in opposition to each other: socialism and statism. Right? You see where I'm going with this, right? Under socialism, all decision-making, all activity would be in society. And the alternative is the state makes the decisions. And so we should be the socialists. I'm not saying we should try to turn that word our way. I mean, that's ridiculous. It would be a waste of effort. There are more important things to do. But I just throw that out for interesting. And I first got this idea. I'll mention this. There was a book written in the 80s by the founder of the the National Taxpayers Union, James Dale Davidson. Anybody remember that name? He wrote a book called The Squeeze. Now, he was not a left-winger or an offbeat kind. He was totally, sort of very respectable, libertarian, maybe somewhat conservative, National Taxpayers Union. And he wrote a book about, and he called it for in that book what he called for the socialization of rules. And by that he meant we should put rule-making back into society rather than have government making the rules. And I remember when I first read that back then, it was like 85 or something. I thought, yeah, I see what he's getting at. And that made me think, yeah, we really are the socialists because we want everything to be in society rather than in the state. Anyway, like I said, that's in passing, although it's probably going on too long to qualify as passing at this point. Okay. All right. So, as important as economic theory is to understanding history, it is not a substitute for history. I think Mises would back me up on this in his great book, Theory of History. Knowing how free markets work cannot tell us in itself that a free market existed in a given historical period. You have to look at the epoch, the period, and see what was going on there. You need to know more than, you need the theory, but you need to know more than the theory. You have to look, see what's going on the ground. So Mises and Rand, notwithstanding, from early on, historical capitalism, now I'm talking about historical capitalism, not what Roderick Long has called ideal capitalism. But historical capitalism has been associated with government intervention on behalf of landowners and even factory owners. Capitalism, of course, is linked to the Industrial Revolution, which began in England, but the rise of industrialism in England followed massive expropriations of the yeomen, the peasantry, from lands they had struggled to acquire de facto rights over for generations. And this is the sort of thing you can find elaborated on by a book that, again, forever has been recommended as libertarian reading, and it's available from the Liberty Press, Liberty Fund, which is Hilaire Belloc's book, The Servile State, where he warns that the coming welfare state is going to recreate serfdom. He argues, he does a good deal of historical work about the Middle Ages and shows how usurpation of customary land rights by what people I might describe as Lockean owners, in other words, the tillers of the soil, people who for generations, families, tilled soil and would really be the owners under a Lockean conception, were dispossessed and turned into tenants because land was given to the nobility. I mean, this even begins when, well, it begins earlier than this, but dramatic examples when William the Conqueror lands and takes over England and divides the land up among, 150 cronies of his or families or something like that. And people who had been working land for generations were suddenly told, they're tenants now. You'll start paying rent to me. How many people have seen Monty Python and the Holy Grail? The great scene early in the, I mean, it's a great scene. It's the best bit of political philosophy in cinema. Watch it on YouTube over and over again and absorb the great lesson. And observe, and what is it? Come and see the violence inherent in the system. One of my favorite. And what happens? That guy comes, the guy's working, I guess it's a man, but he thinks it's a woman, old woman. He says, I'm a man. Anyway, scratching at the land, and the king comes along and says, I'm your king. And, you know, basically, this is my land. And the peasant demanded an explanation. What do you mean? Who made you the king? You know. Look it up. It's great. But there's a lot of truth to that. Those guys knew some history. Okay. As another Carson, this time Kevin Carson, wrote in the Freeman, not as long ago as Clarence Carson's. In the old world, especially Britain, the expropriation of the peasant majority by a politically dominant landed oligarchy took place over several centuries in the late medieval and early modern period. It began with the enclosure of the open fields in the later Middle Ages. Under the Tudors, church fiefdoms, especially monastic lands, were expropriated by the state and distributed among the landed aristocracy. The new owners evicted or rack-rented the peasants. This is also played on very hard by Belloc. I know it sounds Marxist, doesn't it? That's because we left the field to the Marxists. The Marxists made a big deal of this. And a lot of us must have thought, well, if the Marxists are talking about it, it can't be any good, or it can't be true, so let's just stay away from it. But it's a gap then in our historical stories, because I don't think there's any question that this sort of thing happened. And there's a lot of evidence to it. And Belloc, who was no Marxist, no socialist in the statist sense, or probably in any, well, maybe in the other sense I was talking about, but certainly not a left-winger, lays quite a bit of stress on how the decentralization that was occurring throughout the Middle Ages was violently disrupted by Henry VIII confiscating the monastic properties, which is like a fifth of England, and it was good land, and doesn't even keep it for himself, but distributes it to the landed aristocracy, the people who already owned a lot of land. And like I said, people who had gained customary rights that might have not have been quite de jure, but they were de facto, were suddenly turned into peasants. I mean, sorry, they were peasants, but they were suddenly turned into tenants, and either hit with high rents or sometimes had to leave altogether. And where they went was, and I'll get to in a second, they went to the, well, eventually they went to factories, not quite the 15th century yet, but or the 16th century, but a little later. The process continues with so-called land reforms and parliamentary enclosures into the 19th century, turning tillers of the soil who had mixed their labor with the land for generations into tenants, as I said. Customs were privatized by the state. That is then given to a privileged class at the expense of people who previously had long-standing customary rights. Now, the economists over the years have said that this was a matter of efficiency, that the commons weren't efficient. You have these big open lands, and you didn't have the rules of individual property rights and parcels, and so this was really a way to rationalize things, and through parliamentary acts and other measures, this was really a move toward markets and private property. But we know from the work done by Eleanor Ostrom, who is a common name around, popular, well-known name around here, and just won the Nobel Prize, that in fact it's not true that the commons have to be badly managed. That people do generate, without the state, do generate customs that create rules for the use of commons, and that she has challenged the idea, and she's not the only one,